Everyone, can I welcome you to the 14th meeting in 2012 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind those who haven't done so to switch off their mobile phones and Blackberries, as they do affect the broadcasting system. Agenda item 1 is declaration of interests. Can I welcome the new member to the committee, Jim Eadie. Jim, I invite you to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I have no registrable interests.
Okay, thank you. And I hope you enjoy your time on this committee. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to record our thanks to Aileen McLeod for her valuable contribution to the committee's work and in her role as European reporter in particular. Obviously, we'll be looking for a new person to take on that post. To be decided later. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation. This is consideration of affirmative instrument, namely the Property Factors Scotland Act 2011 Modification Order 2012. I refer members to paper 1, which has an attached copy of the instrument and the executive note. Can I welcome Margaret Burgess, Minister of Housing and Welfare, to her first evidence session with the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee and congratulate you on your appointment. Can I also welcome supporting officials Gordon Patterson, Team Leader, and Francis Murphy, Senior Policy Officer, both of the Private Housing Services Division. Minister, can I invite you to make introductory remarks on the Property Factors Instrument?
Okay, thank you, Convener. And thanks to the committee for inviting me to speak about this draft order that the Scottish Ministers have laid for Parliament's approval. The order amends the Property Factors Act to allow certain personal information supplied by applicants to be omitted from the public register of property factors. The Act requires Ministers to take into account certain information when deciding if an applicant is a fit and proper person to be entered onto the Property Factors Register. Information relating to a person's criminal convictions for offences involving fraud or other dishonesty, violence or drugs, and other contraventions of the law relating to discrimination, property or debt. However, the Act doesn't set out how Ministers should obtain this information in order to be able to consider it. We concluded that it is necessary to ask applicants to self-declare any convictions and contraventions information when they apply to be on the register. The recently made negative procedure instrument, the Property Factors Registration Scotland Regulations 2012, which came into force on the 1st of July 2012, creates this requirement for property factors to supply this information when they apply to be on the register. This instrument was made using the power within the Act for Ministers to prescribe further information to be supplied on application. However, the Act also contains a requirement to include in the public register all the information supplied on the application. What this means is that without the current order under consideration, Ministers would be obliged to publish personal information, some of it sensitive, on the public register of property factors. Ministers' view is that this can't have been Parliament's intention when approving that the register of property factors should be available to the public, nor do I believe publication of this data would be in the public interest. Ministers are required by the Act to take a decision on whether a person is fit and proper, and the purpose of gathering this information is to inform that decision of the Ministers. The Government's concern is that publication of this information is likely to contravene the right to private life guaranteed by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So in summary, removal of the requirement to publish this personal information contained within the application will not water down the requirement for each property factor to comply with a fit and proper person test. It will also not affect the publication of information relating to the business and the property portfolio held by that property factor business. It will therefore not impact on the key intention of the Act to increase transparency of the relationship between property factors and homeowners for whom they provide a service.
Thank you very much. And can I note that we've been joined by Annalyn Murphy, Solicitor from the Scottish Government. Can I invite comments or questions from members?
I was just going to start by asking if it is your belief that the apparent requirement to publish this type of information would deter certain individuals from coming forward, and whether there are in fact any examples of that having already happened.
Well, I'm not aware of examples, but I might pass that over to the legal team if you're aware of examples.
Yeah. So far, we're not aware of any examples of people avoiding coming forward in the legislation that way. We've already had quite a large response to the registration, the applications that have come in. Up to about 200 have come in already in submitting this information.
Would it be safe to assume, however, that it would be a deterrent factor in the longer term if the loophole hadn't been closed?
Quite possible.
Yeah, I mean, it may well have been, yes.
Anyone else got any questions?
I just find, Convener, a little odd that property factors with or people who wish to be property factors are coming to you to be registered with a number of convictions. Can you give us any idea of how common that might be?
Yeah, you've seen the applications.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that we don't know at this stage how many applicants will come forward and actually declare convictions. We have received one application so far where there has been notification on it, self-declaration of convictions in the past, but what needs to be taken is a judgment on how old those convictions are and what they are actually for. So we don't know at this stage how many. We are aware that there's obviously issues within the industry for which this Act was aimed to address, but until we get the applications in, we're not sure at this point how many people will be declaring convictions.
Just it's my understanding the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act would apply to people with convictions, so they wouldn't need to declare those, would they, if they're past the particular time limits on that. So I would have thought current convictions were actually relevant information.
In terms of relevant information, they're relevant information for ministers in making their judgment and decision, but it's not relevant to the public to have that information.
I understand, Minister, entirely the point about full disclosure of personal information and not putting that into the public domain. But I'd like to understand the issue around new information that comes to light not being placed on the register. As I understand it, the Act under Section 3.2 says that this information need only be provided as it stands at the time of application to the register and need not be updated even if additional convictions and contraventions are made until the next date of application. I'd just like to understand what the rationale for that decision was, either from yourself or from the legal team.
Well, that's a matter that's on the face of the Act, as passed by the Parliament. You'll be aware that this emanated as a Members' Bill. So the policy is set out in the Act that information, that only certain information will be updated as set out in Section 7. So essentially the conviction information that's included in the application will indeed be a snapshot in time, and then further re-registration, if that's what the property factor applies for, wants to continue to operate as a property factor, will then apply again for registration in 3 years' time. So it is true that the conviction or contravention information is a snapshot in time, and that would be another reason for not including that information in the register, because as the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act of 1974 would apply, conviction information could become inaccurate during the course of the 3-year period of registration if the conviction becomes spent during that period.
Anyone else got any further questions? Okay, we move to the next agenda item, which is the formal debate on the SSI, the Property Factors Scotland Act 2011 Modification Order 2012 draft. This is formal consideration of this motion. Can I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S4M04090?
I would move that motion S4M04090, that the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee recommends that the Property Factors Scotland Act 2011 Modification Order 2012 draft be approved.
Anyone else want to make any further comment on this? So I put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S4M04090 in the name of Margaret Burgess be approved. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. Can I thank the Minister and the witnesses for their attendance today and suspend briefly till we have a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Okay, we move on to agenda item 4, Water Resources Scotland Bill. The committee will now hear further evidence on the Water Resources Scotland Bill at stage 1 from the 2 witness panels, the first of which is from SEPA. So can I welcome David Harley, Water and Land Unit Manager from SEPA, and thank you very much for your written evidence. Margaret, would you like to start off the questioning, please?
Good morning. I've got 2 questions to ask you. First one is, what is SEPA's views on the adequacy of the consultation that took place prior to the introduction of the bill?
We've got no particular comments to make about the consultation process.
So you're quite happy
we're content with that process.
Yep. Okay. And will the proposal in the bill have a positive net impact on Scotland's environment, particularly the water environment, and could the bill have included further safeguards to protect the environment?
The bill certainly adds to additional of the existing powers we have to protect the water environment. There's several key areas where it helps, and things like the additional controls on pollutants going into the sewerage system is of beneficial. Definitely beneficial to our existing powers. Scottish Water having additional powers when it comes to taking samples is again beneficial, and the overall hydronation agenda complements the river basin planning process, which we're very much a lead authority on. So in the main, it's a good thing. It assists us in our role. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Malcolm.
Can you explain why SEPA thinks that the bill should be amended to require Scottish ministers to specifically consider social and environmental factors in seeking to develop the value of Scotland's water?
Yes, we see that it talks specifically about value, where we think that should be that should also be environmental and social elements should be also considered in the bill. we feel that's sort of integral to the value of Scotland's water, and it's something that we're particularly interested in, as you can imagine.
So you think it's important to make that explicit? Because, I mean, I think the officials last week said it was included in other benefit, but do you feel it would be better if it was explicit?
We do,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, okay. In your written evidence, you raised some concern that a direction from Scottish Minister should not compromise SEPA's ability to undertake its core duties. Now, I won't ask you to explain all your core duties, but it might be useful if you described your core duties in relation to water. And then I wonder whether you think the bill should be amended to ensure that such a situation where your core duties are threatened doesn't arise.
Well, when it comes to water, water is probably our largest core duty in terms of scale. About a third of the organisation is involved in protecting the water environment, reporting on the water environment, and regulating. And when I talk about the water environment, I must stress I'm not just talking about Scottish Water's activities. I'm talking about all water environmental issues, whether it be land use or agriculture or other industries such as distilling or hydro. It's a key objective of ours to deliver on the river basin management plans. The river basin management plans report on and set objectives for protecting and improving the water environment. So we certainly wouldn't want to see that compromised in any way. So we would want that to be protected.
So do you think the bill could be amended in order to kind of guarantee, well, in order to address your concerns on that?
I'm not sure exactly in what way or how to actually achieve that, but any additional guarantees we have that our core duties on protecting and improving the water environment could be achieved, then we'd welcome that.
Can you think of a direction that, I don't want to put ideas into the government's head, but could you think of a direction that might threaten your core duties?
No, not in this context.
No.
I suppose we don't want to be distracted from our core duty.
Yeah.
If there was too much emphasis on value, then maybe we could be. Whereas if environment is incorporated as part of this, which it should be, it's integral to the value of Scotland's water then.
But if it takes you away from your environmental focus, basically.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, still on the subject of directions, when asked for possible examples of what a direction to a designated body could include, Scottish Government officials indicated that it could include the creation of a subsidiary or a requirement to work abroad. What are your views on these examples, and is there a need for the potential scope of a direction to be set out in the bill?
Well, as I say, our core duty is to Scotland's environment. We would assist in any initiatives to, to facilitate any working abroad. But again, we have to, we are tasked to protecting Scotland's water environment. So
do you think the potential scope of a direction should be restricted in the bill in some way?
No comment on that, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
But you will be aware that in terms of Scottish Water, they now have work overseas. Are you fully aware of what they're doing, and is there an avenue for SEPA to also use their skills to help in other countries, maybe developing countries, where sewage is a problem? And we've seen with Scottish Water that's actually been very beneficial to the organisation in terms of employees seeing new avenues of developing their careers. Is that something you think that SEPA as an organisation would be up for?
Yes, we'd be interested in that. But in these constrained days, we'd have to be sure that we also concentrate on these core duties. But yes, we would facilitate and assist and cooperate in those initiatives.
Anyone else got any questions on this part? No? Okay, if we move on to Alex.
I've got a couple of questions on the abstraction part. First of all, SEPA indicated in written evidence that it supports the proposed new regime for the control of large-scale abstraction. Can you explain why you consider the new regime necessary and what it adds to the current controlled activities regulation regime?
Well, from an environmental perspective, the controlled activities regulations deal with that, and we don't need any further powers for environmental issues. If ministers feel there's a need to consider wider social or economic issues, then there may be need for further powers. But from SEPA's perspective, the powers that we have are sufficient to protect the water environment.
Yeah. In other evidence and written evidence, we've heard from a number of specialist interest groups within the country. And we've heard calls, for example, for the abstraction regime in future to be based around consumption rather than abstraction. Scottish Government officials did indicate that that could be difficult, but they didn't reject it out of hand. What's SEPA's views on that type of suggestion?
In relation to a new regime or in relation to our existing powers?
I think we're talking about the new regime here, but if you have any, if it relates to your existing powers as well, this is the time to tell us.
Well, we're very much interested in all forms of abstraction, because even if abstraction returns the water to the water environment, there could be there's a gap in the water environment. There's a stretch of river potentially, which is depleted of water. Now that stretch could be several hundred metres, or it could be several miles or tens of miles. For example, in the hydro sector, there's a lot of cross-catchment transfers of water, which can result in localised impacts unless they're not properly addressed. So from an environmental point of view, it's important that we deal with both consumptive and non-consumptive use of water.
Yeah. I think that's very comprehensive. Thank you very much.
Can I just follow up? We had evidence from the Bill team last week suggesting that there could be a growing market for Scottish water beyond our boundaries. Do you see any dangers in that prospect that you'd be concerned would have to ensure that environmental protection remains in place?
Well, the Controlled Activities Regulations give us the powers to deal with the environmental considerations, whether it's from an internal abstractor or from somebody beyond Scotland. So the same would apply. So we would use our powers to ensure that the environmental impact is sustainable and minimised. So it doesn't really make it, to us, it doesn't make a difference who makes that application or comes to us with that proposal.
Okay. So in terms of Scottish ministers would obviously consider proposals that are brought for large-scale transfer of water away from Scotland, if you like. Let's say they approve of something, but in your view, that would have a negative environmental impact. How do we square that particular circle?
Well, first of all, CAR still applies, so we would do our job. And I understand ministers are required to consult us in this process, should this new regime come to pass. Okay. So I would hope that our views would be taken into account.
Okay, fine. But you don't think there's anything needs to be written into the bill to guarantee that advice, your advice would be...
That would be helpful if extra strength in that was needed.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, if we move on to part 3 on Scottish Water's functions, you state in written evidence that while SEPA is, quote, fully supportive of Scottish Water being given specific powers to develop its assets to support the generation of renewable energy, such developments of assets should not be at the expense of the environment or of meeting future environmental objectives. What do you mean by future objectives, and how might they impact on the work of Scottish Water?
Okay, bear with me, just want to get to my... We work very closely with Scottish Water and the Scottish Government in the quality and standards process. And the quality and standards process is Scottish Water's investment programme, which deals with improving their assets and their sewage works and their abstractions and essentially investing in their system. The environmental considerations are extremely important. Scottish Water has many hundreds of abstractions and many thousands of sewage works, all of which have a potential to impact. And some, whether they be ageing or whether they be not working as they were designed to, may be still causing an impact. So we have it's a very established and effective investment process, which we influence in the prioritisation of that process. So we would not want to see any distraction from that process.
Can you maybe give an example to make it clearer as to what you
Okay, one example would be, at the moment, we, along with Scottish Government and representatives from Glasgow and Scottish Water, are considering how best to deal with Glasgow's sewage, which currently discharges into the Clyde. And how we eventually deal with that will take considerable investment. That's a large-scale example. But all around the country, there are, currently at this time, there are various sewage works and various assets of Scottish Water which are being invested in, which are being improved to ensure that the water environment is improved. We have to remember that the river basin management plans are very ambitious in terms of their objectives for Scotland's water environment. And the quality and standards process is the means by which we achieve those objectives. So that's in terms of water quality, so mainly from sewage discharges, but also in terms of abstractions, because some abstractions do result in environmental impacts at the point of abstraction. So,
could that, for example, be peatlands where they might dry out because of water abstraction, or?
Not specifically peatlands. It's generally the water, lochs and rivers and groundwater.
Okay. In response to the Scottish Government's consultation on the legislative proposals, it was suggested by Scottish Land and Estates and the Scottish Anglers Association that giving Scottish Water new powers to access land to test water would duplicate powers that SEPA already have, and that this would therefore be a poor use of taxpayers' money. Do you regard these powers as duplication, and how will you differentiate SEPA's role from that of Scottish Water?
I think these powers are complementary to SEPA's role. We have a large initiative underway at the moment, which is looking at diffuse pollution in 14 priority catchments around Scotland. And this is rural diffuse pollution, so it's essentially pollution associated with land management. It's a very challenging area for us and for Scotland to deal with. So diffuse pollution comes from a range of activities and involves a range of pollutants and a range of pollutant pathways. But one area of particular concern for Scotland is diffuse pollution, which causes drinking water problems, so which actually pollutes raw water. Now, the traditional solutions for dealing with raw water is to invest heavily in treatment systems, in plant, in technology to remove pollutants from raw water, but that is not sustainable. We should be thinking about how best to get that pollutant off the land in the first place and to minimise its effect on raw water. And it's certainly far, far more efficient to do so. So in those areas where drinking water is a problem, we feel it's appropriate that Scottish Water work with us and assist us in mitigating that and working with landowners to achieve that. And that's already happening. We work hand in hand with Scottish Water staff in a number of catchments, but particularly in the Yugi catchment in the northeast, where we're working with land managers, raising awareness, advising land managers of their obligations, and assisting them in ensuring that drinking water that pollutants that affect drinking water are mitigated against. So we think it's complementary.
So are the powers sufficient at the moment, or do you envisage new regulation being put on those landowners in order to safeguard and raise water quality before it goes to treatment?
We have a series of general binding rules, which is a sort of baseline requirement of land managers to protect the water environment. We're at early stages in terms of regulating against those general binding rules and making the sector aware of their obligations. It's hard for us at this stage to specify any additional regulations. I think we need more time in this initiative, and then after that time, and we gather data and evidence, I think then we could maybe make the case for further regulations.
So are the initiatives at the moment encouraging lands and estates to farm in a different way and decide when they put on fertilisers or which fertilisers they put on? Or
yes.
Can you give some examples?
In the widest sense, things like planting buffer strips to allow some wild land, a short strip of wild land between the farmed land and the watercourse. That is major advantages. Preventing cattle from getting into watercourses. The application of fertiliser, the spreading of slurries close to watercourses. But also there's specific when it comes to drinking water, there's additional measures that we feel are needed when it comes to the use of pesticides. So some of that goes above and beyond the general binding rules. So things like using what they call biobeds in farmyards. These are areas where you could fill machinery with pesticides and which actually allow the breakdown of pollutants within the actual system, within this biobed area. Also things like the safe storage of pesticides and the filling of pesticides in the right place, not beside a watercourse or not over drains. Some of these things are really quite simple. Another possible measure which isn't set out in general binding rules would be getting the farmers to replace a damaging pesticide or a high-risk pesticide, which maybe pose less risk to the water environment.
Why did I think Alec Johnson would
I
want
wasn't
to
going
come
to ask a question specifically, but when we visited Scottish Water, they talked about this to some extent, and the specific issue that was raised was the use of slug pellets, which was a limited practice that had a very large contribution towards the contamination of drinking water, and where Scottish Water were already testing and working with farmers to eliminate that particular pollutant. And I think this is an example of an area where there is a lot of positive work to be done in order to take out very small use pesticides that can make a big difference to drinking water.
Agreed. Yes.
Okay. Gordon.
Thank you, Convener. You indicated in written evidence that SEPA expends considerable effort in dealing with the effects of blockages to the sewer system caused by grease, fat and oil. Can you quantify how much it costs to deal with such incidents, and whether you think the proposed new system of encouraging traders to use proper disposal methods is robust enough to deal with this problem?
On the first question, it is difficult to quantify those costs. We have a pollution database which records the nature pollutions from all across Scotland's water environment. It doesn't go down to the level of pollution as a result of fats, oils and greases. It does go down to the level of pollutions from Scottish Water's assets, and sometimes it's very hard to know exactly what the main cause is. But it is significant. These fats, oil and greases do clog up once they cool down. They clog up systems, and that can compromise the working of the waste stream and result in overflows from the waste side of Scotland Water's infrastructure. But it can also result in blockages that then result in surface water being contaminated with foul water, with wastewater. So across the board, we do find that we feel that a significant number of pollutions are caused as a result of this. So we welcome these powers. We think it's important that Scottish Water is able to properly control what gets into their system.
How easy do you think it will be to be able to trace the trade premises that's responsible for it, bearing in mind that you might get in an average high street, you know, 3 or 4 premises next to each other that all use fats and greases and oils.
No doubt there's challenges associated with that, but Scottish Water have expertise in this. This is their job. We work with them probably today or tomorrow. There'll be a squad, there'll be a SEPA officer working in conjunction with Scottish Water officers trying to trace a problem that's gone into their sewer, trying to trace back up to see where that's come from. And you're right, in some cases it's not straightforward, but in other cases it may well be. So it's challenging, but I do think these they are meaningful, these powers.
Right. The other side of that is septic tanks, and can you explain why you consider the proposed powers to deal with septic tanks and multiple ownerships do not go far enough, and how you think these could be improved?
Okay, well we, as you know, we regulate septic tanks by a system of registration under the Controlled Activities regulations, and that system has there's two main reasons for that system. One is to ensure that when new septic tanks are being proposed or new developments are being proposed, that they're sited in the right place and that the right treatment is provided. So that's the first, so it's for new development. The second is that we have a good understanding of where septic tanks are situated, so that we can understand that if should there be an accumulation of septic tanks in an area that might cause a problem, that we can then tackle that. What was the second part of your question again, sorry?
If you think there's any way that it could be improved, the proposed powers?
So, a particular problem we have is where you have a septic tank which is shared among several householders, and it's a problem, then it's quite difficult taking any enforcement action. Of course, we have a sort of a ratcheting up level of sort of interaction with those people and with enforcement. However, the difficulty is that septic tanks individually don't cause a huge impact. They're not going to cause fish kills. They're not going to cause major downgrades of watercourses, but cumulatively do cause a problem. And locally, they can be, as you can imagine, they can be pretty messy. They cause nuisance and amenity problems. So it's hard for us to make a case for a procurator fiscal on the back of one person's contribution to a pollution problem. So if there's a shared situation and not everybody's playing ball, then it's very hard. We get stuck. It's hard for us to proceed. If this, quite often there's several people who do want to proceed and do the right thing by the environment and sort out their system or upgrade it. But we end up in this kind of quagmire. And this does help us, the power here for allowing, not having to have everybody bought into the upgrade and to the investment. So that does assist us.
So how is the registration system working, and are all septic tank owners registered, and how is that register maintained?
Not everybody's registered. There's a fair proportion. We feel there's about 60% odd. It's hard to get an exact number, but we feel it's about 60% which are registered. Up until this point, we've been relying on the house conveyancing system to get septic tanks registered at the point of sale, which will get us there slowly. So it is not complete, and that's why government have asked ourselves and Scottish Water to work together to understand more about this problem and find out exactly where these septic tanks are which aren't registered, and have an awareness and communications initiative to get more people registered, and then with that we can then better understand the issue within Scotland.
Thank you.
Do you see a situation where many people who have septic tanks that are in multiple ownership or old septic tanks are going to have to replace them?
There will be a requirement for that. I don't think it's going to be wholesale. I think what we'll have to do is target to where there's problems. We're not going to go out and certainly we don't have the resources, and we don't want to go out and be heavy-handed on this and be knocking on all doors and checking in all septic tanks. Certainly, we don't have those resources. But where there are problems and where there are known issues, then we should direct our resources to those places. And if replacement is required or upgrading is required, then that's what we'll pursue. But I don't see it being sort of a nationwide issue. I don't see it being huge numbers of people. It's where there's known problems.
So, I mean, you obviously know where in the country there are problems, you know. are you kind of pre-warning people that, you know, there is a problem in their area with wastewater?
I think what we should do, and again, Scottish governments have asked ourselves in Scottish Water to work on this, is that we fully understand and document where the impacts are. And you're right, we do have an idea of where some of those are. That we then, first of all, it's about awareness raising, getting people registered, getting people to make sure they, first of all, that they maintain their tanks properly, because that's a key issue. Desludging your tank every couple of years is a minimum requirement. That may not be happening, so make sure that happens. And it's only when all these that sort of level of maintenance is secured, but only at that point, if we still have a problem, would we ask for upgrades or other solutions.
I mean, is it the case that septic tanks need to be desludged every 2 years? Because some cases, you know, you're told you don't need to do it every 2 years. It's because the tank's working extremely efficiently. Well,
they do. Tanks need to be desludged, and that's the sort of awareness raising that we need to get on with. The solid doesn't disappear. And you know, the idea is that the liquid part overtops and goes into the environment, becomes treated in soakaways or gets diluted by a discharge into a watercourse. But the solids remain. So at some point they will clog up the system, and when that happens, it either overflows into the environment and causes more pollution than it needs to, or it'll result in a mess in the garden. So it's not pretty.
Or smelly. Right, Adam.
Yes, SEPA have welcomed the proposed introduction of water shortage orders, but you've also highlighted that the water shortage order provisions don't replace the controls imposed by the CAR regulations on new or altered water abstractions. Can you explain how these controls work and whether you consider them compatible with the proposed water shortage order regime?
Yes, CAR was amended in 2011, last year, to allow us to come up with a process of fast-tracking CAR applications in the event of there being a water scarcity for some reason or other. It's very important in this process that we work with Scottish Water and other water users to ensure that A, the public supply is secured, but B, that other water users aren't impacted, whether that's industry or fisheries or other water interests, and C, essentially, that the water environment is still protected as far as possible within that challenging circumstance. So we have that process already. This is more, I think, about Scottish Water having the ability to manage its own system and to impose potentially restrictions on water use within its system to facilitate that. So what it does is it gives extra flexibility in these situations.
So they are compatible?
Yes, that's a short answer.
Yes, okay. Thanks.
Anyone else got any further questions? Okay, can I thank you very much for your evidence, and I briefly suspend this session to allow the changeover of witnesses. Okay, we continue to take evidence on the Water Resources Scotland Bill at stage 1 from a panel representing a range of environmental organisations. So can I welcome Lisa Webb, Water Policy Officer for RSPB Scotland, Chris Spray, Council Member from the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and Andy Miles, Parliamentary Officer from Scottish Environmental Link. Adam, would you like to start the questions on this session, please?
Thanks for coming along this morning, giving of your time to the committee. Can I firstly ask about the consultation process on the bill? Were you satisfied with the consultation process and with the government's, Scottish Government's response to any of the concerns that you raised during the course of that consultation?
I think in general we've been happy with the consultation process in that there have been the 2 formal consultations on the hydronation aspects. One element though that was of concern to us was the part about large-scale abstractions, which is in the bill but wasn't mentioned in any of the previous consultation responses. So I think we were just a bit unclear about the sort of purpose and intention of that part of the bill.
Could I add that Link's members have been in contact with government for a very long time on matters relating to fresh water, way back to the days of the Woos Bill in the first Parliament. So it's part of a long ongoing process. We're fairly plugged into the government agencies, business, and the consulting with most of the stakeholders across water issues.
You may be plugged in, but are you listened to, Andy, and you feel you get a fair hearing and a decent response?
I certainly think so. I think over the years that, for example, in the first Parliament, Link organised a trip for members of the Scottish Parliament to Inchmarsh near Aviemore to have a look at floodplains. And I think that the Parliamentary Committee at the time found that exceptionally useful, and they learnt about floodplains, and floodplains were then included as a wetland within the definitions in the bill. The civil servants then said, oh, could we come and see this floodplain as well? And they did so. We didn't need to take the Scottish Whisky Association because they have a distillery right next to the floodplain. But you know, there's a mutual understanding of many of these issues, and that transfers through to things like a meeting that we recently had with SEPA and the CBI to discuss the SEPA better regulation issue and consultation, in particular as it refers to water issues. And the Scottish Whisky Association were part of that meeting, the CBI delegation. So I think that our expertise is recognised within the Link member organisations, and I think we have been listened to fairly well. We haven't always got our way, of course, but we have been listened to fairly well over many, many years.
If I can just add to that, wearing a hat as a trustee director of Tweed Forum, which is one of the most well-known catchment organisations operating in Scotland, we've had a fantastic consultation, including a visit from the previous minister who spent a day with us in the Borders, talking about water issues and catchments and listening very well. So I think, you know, wearing that side, we've had very good input.
Okay, that's good to hear. Now, can I ask about the concerns that you do have, particularly about, to start off with anyway, about the definition of a hydronation? Can you expand on those concerns and explain what you think a hydronation should be?
Yes, certainly. I think for us, we're very keen that a hydronation is one where the water environment is managed at the catchment scale, taking a very much an integrated approach, and in doing so that can deliver a multitude of benefits for Scotland, including improved water quality, flood risk management, carbon storage, all of these things. And a hydronation should be very mindful that the environment, a healthy environment, underpins its economy and a whole range of services. I think with the sort of the rhetoric surrounding some of the hydronation proposals was very much about Scotland has abundant and very clean water resource. But we would argue that, yes, it does, but there is still a way to go in terms of improving. I think only 2/3 of our water bodies are in good or better status under Water Framework Directive definitions. So there's a long way to go in improving them and preventing deterioration of them. So we don't want to be complacent because, a lot of hydronation is about selling our expertise internationally. So we're very much keen to see things, get things right at home first of all.
I think it's worth just adding to that, perhaps, that we really welcome the approach and the interest in hydronation and in a catchment approach and in water as a key issue for Parliament to address. As my colleague has said, we start from the opinion that environment underpins the economy. The economy, if you like, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, that way round. But we're delighted to see a landscape approach, one that would build very nicely with the ecosystem approach of the land use strategy. So I think we very much welcome that and would work to help develop it.
Malcolm.
If I can just, I suppose, just go through the bill section by section. I mean, clause 1, I think all of you have expressed some concerns about that, and not surprisingly, you would like there to be an explicit reference to social and environmental factors in subsection 3 of clause 1. I mean, the government officials, I think, said, well, I have to be careful, I can't remember what their exact words were, but they basically, I think, gave the impression that social and environmental would be included there. I think it was would rather than could. But I suppose what I'm interested in is, I mean, do you think that it's kind of just like an omission and that the intention of the government is to include social and environmental factors? Or are you actually more suspicious than that, and are you concerned that actually a message is being sent out here that the economic factors are overriding and anything else is a bit subsidiary? So I'm just not quite clear whether you have a serious concern here or whether you just think it's a, an almost accidental omission that social and environmental factors are not mentioned.
I think it would be fair to say we are concerned somewhat at the omission, and especially with the emphasis on sustainable economic growth. We are, we would like to see environmental and social benefits and impacts explicitly mentioned here to ensure that they are taken into account.
We have a broad concern across Environment Link that sustainability is being defined in terms of sustainable economic growth, and that actually sustainable economic growth can be viewed as a contradiction in terms, that economic growth is not necessarily sustainable development. We tend to adopt the legal definition of sustainable development that is shared and agreed by the UK government and all 3 devolved administrations. And we also note that sustainable development is defined in European law, and that all our water legislation falls under the Water Framework Directive from the European Union. Sustainability, therefore, is at the heart of the matter. And sustainability within the definitions that have been accepted by all the administrations in the UK is quite clearly a matter which includes respecting environmental limits. But as Chris has said, we think that you can't actually separate them out and do a bill which is only about the economics of water. If you're going to deal with the water environment, you have to deal with it from a sustainable perspective, which includes social, economic and environmental considerations. So we do have concern when a piece of legislation appears to be weighted towards the economic and to leave out the social and the environmental. And our advice, for what it's worth, would be that it's better when you're dealing with matters of sustainability to always remember that there are 3 principal parts, environmental, social and economic, and it's the relationships between them which are vitally important. But again, as Chris says, the there is a tendency in much of our media and much of our public discourse, not just in Scotland but across the Western world, to consider economics as somehow supreme, to have a primacy. And I think it would be fair to say that our view is that the economy is based in our environment. And if you treat the environment badly, you can end up with terrible economic consequences. And we worry about all three parts of the sustainable development definition, not just the environmental. We're equally concerned that people in Scotland have clean water to drink and to bathe in, and for all other social purposes, that our economy and many of our industries are based on our clean water, that those are remembered just as much as our concerns for biodiversity and wildlife, for which clean water is crucial.
Okay, well, that was useful. I think that...
Malcolm, can you give some examples of where this might be in conflict?
I'm sorry, I don't...
Well, where sustainable economic growth might be in conflict with social environment and environmental factors.
I don't think that sustainable economic growth is going to end up in conflict, and I don't tend to see this in terms of conflict. We see it in terms of relationships, and it's undoubtedly the case that if, for example, you were mentioning a case earlier about the possibility of the appearance of parasites appearing, Chris. Would you explain that one?
Well, one example may be work by Price Waterhouse has estimated that the value of the salmon running up the Tweed is roughly £18 million a year and 512 jobs to the local economy. Now, this water here, though you probably don't know it, actually almost certainly comes from the Tweed. The top of the Tweed reservoirs provide Edinburgh with their water. Now, economic growth that therefore perhaps might take water from the top of a catchment may have an effect downstream, unknown, unintended, from other people's uses. And there's one example where we know it's important. Other industries that clearly depend on a very clean environment, such as the whisky industry, and the reference there is to the potential disaster in terms of marketing were a certain parasite to come into the country and attach itself to salmon, because there would be a challenge as to how to get rid of Geraldactylus, I think that's right, which would actually lead us to probably have to take dramatic and drastic action, which would not fit with a countryside and a marketing around whisky, around tourism, that trades on just how good and clean the water and the environment of Scotland is. So there's an inherent link, and it's, I think my colleague's right, it's not about conflict, it's about recognising it. So whether it was omission by accident or by design, in a sense, is not for us to comment on or even really to worry wondering about. It's just that we feel it must be in there. And the Water Framework Directive clearly says water is not a commercial product like any other, but rather a heritage which must be protected, defended, and treated as such. So sustainable use, absolutely, but we need to know the limits.
Framework Directive will still apply, obviously. So, I mean, in a sense, does that not reassure you in some way, or do you feel the Water Framework Directive is being diluted in some way by either this clause of the bill or the bill more generally?
That's a matter which I think in the last analysis only the courts could answer, because you're actually asking for a legal judgment. Is the Water Framework Directive being transposed properly in this bill? And I don't think that our legal expertise across the link organisations, although considerable, is enough to give you good advice on that subject, because we tend not to be lawyers.
I think it's worth saying, though, that Scotland has a very good track record of treating and turning European directives into some pretty aspirational and holistic legislation. So the Water Environment Water Services Act and the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act are both very, very good bits of legislation which have that wonderful catchment outlook. So I think we're very happy with that. It's about implementation thereof that we're actually keen to see follow up.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to come in briefly because I've had a sudden attack of deja vu. and it's been caused by Andy Miles, who was probably around at the time that I'm remembering. It must have been about 12 years ago just now. I was in the process of dropping Conservative opposition to the creation of national parks and becoming a supporter of that legislation. And part of the reason for it was that during the progress of that bill, we managed to institutionalise effectively the balancing of environment, social and economic issues within that legislation. Now, Andy Miles has today come right back to that again and pointed out that the same thing is required in this piece of legislation. Do you think perhaps after the passage of the National Park Bill we put that particular step of progress on the shelf and haven't done enough with it since?
That's, if you'll pardon my say-so, a very broad question, because it reflects on almost everything that Link does. We are still in pursuit of sustainability, and we've produced publications on specific issues and our broader discourse in Scottish public life as to the fact that sustainability still needs to be pursued. I think that the record of this Parliament and the record of successive Scottish governments has been good in making progress towards sustainability, but I think that it would be very difficult for me to say, representing Environment Link, that we have yet achieved it. And on the way to attempting to achieve sustainable development and sustainability, there are brilliant examples of bills that Chris has mentioned, or wider bills like the Climate Change Bill, bills like the Marine Act passed in the last Parliament. There are superb steps which we have taken, which we as organisations have pushed for and campaigned for, and which Parliament has dealt with in taking significant steps forward. So I wouldn't say I think that we have lost the edge in that agenda, but I think it is our job to constantly speak up for the environmental concerns within legislation that is passing through this Parliament. And that is what we're doing. We are saying that there is no question that this bill is a setback for the sustainability agenda, because apart from anything else, as Malcolm Chisholm has pointed out, European law is supranational and would be applicable directly over and above any legislation passed here. Although, again, I would say that that's a very broad interpretation of the legal position. But we think that it's worthwhile, if you are pushing forward legislation which is going to improve the water environment, that it takes all of those aspects into account. And we see it as rather difficult to try and separate out social or economic or environmental aspects of water and deal with them alone.
Ask some more specific questions about Part 1 of the bill. What benefit would there be in extending the definition of water resources to include peatland habitats? I think somebody raised that. I think was it? Yes.
Yeah, we have. Well, a recent IUCN report has indicated that about 70% of our water, drinking water, does come from peatland-dominated catchments. So we think, we're very keen to see a sustainable catchment management approach to improving drinking water quality, and in doing so there needs to be recognition that peatland restoration and good peatland management is a really integral part of delivering that. I don't know if you're aware, but there's an issue of when peatlands become badly eroded or damaged, the amount of dissolved organic carbon, which is basically the brown sort of peaty colour of water, that increases. And it takes more effort and more expenditure at the water treatment works to then remove that dissolved organic carbon. Therefore, by ensuring that peatlands are covered by the definition in this Act, it could help us, manage peatlands for the benefit of water quality, but also delivering those economic benefits in terms of driving down costs at water treatment works.
If I can just follow up that, having at one time been a director of a water company just south of the border, that question of dissolved organic carbon and treatment, particularly using trihalomethanes, which is a carcinogen, is of increasing interest and increasing cost to water companies across the whole of the United Kingdom. But I think one of the fundamental things here is that by missing out them, we're going away from the whole catchment approach. What is delightful about this is that it talks about a catchment-wide approach, and that should include groundwater as well as surface water. It should include water in all its various forms. So this idea that one leaves out one element is inherently flawed from the very start for the rest of it. I think the other thing is that it highlights the fact that there are economic gains to treating the problem at its source, as opposed to treating it with a large new building, treatment works, or whatever. And that then continues up to the way we manage catchments for flooding. And the Flood Act I mentioned earlier, which is a superb piece of legislation, again asks people to treat the problem at source far, far better, because you also get multiple benefits for environment, for wildlife, for people, for the economy. Don't just build the wall down the bottom. So to leave out peat is just wrong. I mean, it's against the whole thing. It should be catchment-wide, and where the water sits is not actually relevant. It's the fact that the water is moving through the catchment.
Okay, thanks. Now, still on part one, the written submissions ask for additional organisations to be listed as designated bodies on the face of the bill. So, can you name some bodies? I think what Scottish canals and national parks are certainly mentioned in one or other of the written submissions, but could you tell us why you think those or other bodies should be included in the bill?
Mm-hmm. So Link's thinking behind that is, as Chris just mentioned, you know, this whole catchment management approach can really deliver a multitude of benefits. And in order to deliver that approach, though, a partnership is really key to that. So it's not going to just involve Scottish Water on its own, but Scottish Water and its regulators, but also wider partners, including, it could be Forestry Commission, the national parks, also NGOs, although, you know, perhaps not placing a duty on them, but we really need to see some sort of duty to ensure that a partnership approach is delivered.
And that, just to follow up, would follow again from what's in the Flood Risk Scotland Management Act, where there is a duty for people to work in partnership. And it's working very well indeed. What I think we'd really wish is that the duty here recognises that the quality and the quantity of our water is fundamentally about how we manage our land. And therefore, people like Forestry Commission, the impact of planting trees is huge on water balance. But I think it'd be even more important that Scottish Water and others enter into agreements with non-governmental organisations, with these catchment organisations like Scottish Wildlife Trust, who are working in places like Coigarch and Cumbernauld, working with local communities. They can go places where, with due respect, the SEPAs of this world can't go, because they're not coming in with a regulatory stick. They can go and talk to land managers in a way that, again, Scottish Water can't go. It's about a partnership, and I think to have a duty to work in partnership, and for those partnerships to recognise the value of communities of the third sector is very, very important. And I think this could be a superb part of this legislation.
So how many extra bodies are we talking about? There's 5 at the moment. I mean, are we talking about an extra 2 or 3, or are we talking about a lot more than that?
Well, we've suggested that it would be the National Parks, the Forestry Commission and Scottish Canals and WICS as bodies that be added. But there are other partners with other expertise. And I would stress, in following up what's been said by my colleagues, that our view here is that the partnership approach allows you to eliminate possible conflicts or mistakes at the earliest possible stage, and that the economic consequences of getting decisions right, because you have sought and had a duty to seek the opinion of the Forestry Commission, who have a duty under the government's proposals to considerably increase the amount of forest coverage in Scotland, to make sure that that isn't done in a way which is sensitive to the water environment. Because if it was done simply by planting up huge catchment areas with Sitka spruce, it would, for example, have considerable effect on the water quality of the water coming out of that catchment. It therefore makes sense, in our view, to actually include these public bodies right at the earliest stage, so that you can reap the benefits of their experience and make sure that down the line you don't run into the problems. It's a preventative approach that we're actually arguing for. And I would substantially agree with what Chris Bray has been saying, that the NGOs are happy to play their part in giving their advice, as we do in many other areas of Scottish economic and social life, to give our advice to try and eliminate problems before they arise with regard to the way that we develop Scotland together.
I think there are some very good examples, both south of the border and abroad, where that critical role of an NGO helps oil the whole process. We're not saying the NGOs should be, registered relevant bodies, but I think the relevant bodies must work with them. And examples we've given include United Utilities working with the RSPB and colleagues in the Lake District, or South West Water, who have, so far, to my knowledge, given £9 million to the West Country Rivers Trust, an NGO, over 3 years to develop a catchment approach. That works out at about 60p, 70p on everyone's bill, and that tackles the whole of their water quality issues, quantity, quality, at source. Going abroad, there are some fantastic examples in America. The whole of New York City's water supply comes from a catchment in the Catskills 135 miles away. It saves them building a several billion-dollar treatment work by working with the communities through an NGO, a farmers' council, in this other area. So there are very good examples elsewhere, and what we're wanting here is a wider definition of the appropriate authorities to include land managers, and that they must work with NGOs, because there are fabulous examples of this being the most effective partnership economically as well as environmentally.
Thank you. Now, finally, on part one, we have a disagreement in relation to clause 4 between yourselves and SEPA. I think in your written evidence, there's a suggestion that a reporting period of 3 years is not sufficiently frequent to ensure Scottish ministers are held accountable for meeting their duty, whereas SEPA's view is that a reporting period shorter than 3 years would be overly onerous, and that the bill's chosen reporting period could fit conveniently with the 6-year reporting cycle for river basin management planning. So I wonder what your take is on that and on SEPA's point of view on that.
Well, I hesitate to describe this as being in conflict with SEPA, but our view is that under existing legislation there are annual reports. There are annual reports on a whole range of environmental matters to Parliament, and that to fit this Act into that same cycle would seem to us to be most appropriate. We also want to make sure that Parliament has the ability to hold the executive branch to account. One of our concerns in the overall approach to achieving sustainability is to make sure that our governance arrangements, the methods and processes of government, are adequate and fit for purpose. And we think that an annual report would be of great assistance to Parliament, because it would give a document once a year which a parliamentary committee could take up and hold the executive to account against that report. Now, there are many such reports. Sadly, quite a few of them are laid before Parliament and simply sit on the shelf. They are laid before Parliament and then no follow-up is made from them. There are annual reports from the agencies which are presented to Parliament, laid before Parliament, and very little happens with them. But to actually give a hook for you as the parliamentarians with the responsibility to hold the government to account, the executive branch to account, the more hooks you have, in our view, the better. And Link members will continue to campaign to ask parliamentarians and parliamentary committees to use those hooks. But if it's reduced to 3 years, then you're setting a precedent for other areas perhaps being put to 3 years, because it would obviously be 3 times as efficient for an organisation like SEPA. But a government agency should have these matters under consideration all the time. And the report is not going to come, frankly, on a completely new basis. Each year or each 3-year period, one report will very much follow under one piece of legislation from the last report. So we're not asking them to do something that is hugely onerous. We're asking them to do something which is sensible and fits in with the pattern of public scrutiny that we've established in Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, we move on then. Alex, you've got some questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm going to move on to the issues of abstraction. And am I right in detecting from your earlier remarks that you feel you perhaps were not consulted appropriately on the development of the control of water abstraction proposals included in the bill?
That would be fair to say, I think, yes.
You seem to give the impression that you were involved in the consultation in other parts. Is it specifically this area that you feel that you were not adequately engaged?
Yes, because this was a late addition, I think. You know, it wasn't mentioned in any of the formal consultations, certainly. And then when the bill was introduced, the large-scale abstractions was in there. And I think in the explanatory notes, it did say that there would be further consultation over the summer recess, but that didn't really happen.
I thought I'd just clarify that matter before I move on to specific questions. You indicated in the written evidence you've submitted that you are concerned that the new regime for authorising large-scale abstractions could be used to allow abstraction to be undertaken solely for economic reasons. Can you explain why you consider this to be a problem and outline how you might think the bill could be amended to alleviate the situation?
Okay, well, first off, I think it's good to remind everyone of the fact that abstraction does place unnecessary pressure on, freshwater habitats with consequences for wildlife and biodiversity. Abstraction is recognised in our river basin management plans as one of the most significant pressures on the water environment as well. It's not clear to us why these proposals for bringing large-scale abstractions under ministerial control are in the bill either, given that there are already powers, as we believe, under the Controlled Activities Regulations for ministers to call in applications and to determine abstraction authorisations. So to us, it's just really not clear as to the purpose, intention, or even the actual legal need for it.
Were there any clues in the 10 megalitre per day threshold that's been set within the bill to indicate why this alternative regime was necessary?
Not especially. So it's a large volume of water, obviously.
You've certainly in your written evidence you have suggested that threshold, that you don't see the rationale for that threshold. Do you have an alternative proposal for how the threshold might be set if it was to progress?
I think our question is why a threshold and why not just build on car? The whole basis of the controlled activity relations is that the base of it is very simple things you get on and do. The peak of the triangle, if you like, is very complex licenses, and this would seem to be a very complex license with lots of externalities brought in as well. So I think we're at a loss to quite understand, and our uncertainty reflects that lack of understanding.
I should also say, hope that in the passage of the bill and in not only your stage 1 proceedings, but if this proceeds to stage 2 and stage 3, that there will be ample opportunity for all members of the committee and ourselves to actually get to the bottom of where this 10 megalitre figure came from. Because, as we've said in our written evidence, we can't really comment on its appropriateness because we don't know where it came from and we don't know what the evidence upon which it is based is. What we do know and what we have said elsewhere in our written evidence is that from an economic point of view, we do know that there are huge economic savings to be made from tackling issues like leakages. And in the government's own hierarchy, reducing use and reducing waste would actually be by far the best economic approach, rather than placing the emphasis on an abstraction regime which we haven't really seen the evidence for.
You've specifically suggested that Scottish ministers should have to consult SEPA and others when considering applications under the new regime, particularly when this may result in duplication of effort with SEPA. Do you think that duplication is worthwhile, and what additional benefits would that achieve?
Well, yeah, I think the point we were making is that, well, if this part remains in the bill, that ministers should have to consult SEPA so that environmental impacts are properly considered. We also think they should have to consult SNH, where proposed abstractions could have an impact on designated nature conservation sites. So I think currently in the bill there is no obligation for that to happen. I think it says ministers may consult SEPA, but we would just like to see that make it compulsory for them
just
to have to do
it
so.
to make sure that that does actually happen.
Exactly.
It must also be said that we hope that if there is to be a duplication of regulations, as the car regulations will still apply, and other regulations and regulatory frameworks will still apply, if there is to be a new part of the regime added, it is strongly to be hoped that the evidence will suggest that there is no conflict here.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Yes, sorry. Yes.
Just come in. We'd asked the question of SEPA earlier with regards to appropriate consultation with SEPA, particularly in the area of large-scale abstraction and perhaps the advent of a new commodity market for Scottish water, transferring Scottish water resource elsewhere. As the bill team sort of indicated last week, there was obviously this prospect opening up of Scottish water resources being perhaps traded south of the border. Is that a concern that you have in terms of what check there will be on that particular process? Is it all down to Scottish ministers determining the economic case for that, or should there be other checks and balances put in place?
I think that if we build on the car basis of regulation, then there has to be an environmental assessment of whether that has an impact. I think that's the key thing. The economic one is another question altogether. I mean, why south of the border should want to get very expensive water from here when you could get it much closer from, say, Kielder Water, which is, after all, one of Western Europe's largest reservoirs, sitting a bit further south of us, and which is already connected through to Durham, Teesside, and into Yorkshire. Water's very expensive to move, and the energy costs are phenomenal. Scottish Water is already the biggest energy user in the country. So I think there are economic questions, but the environmental ones have to be there and have to be assessed. And we don't want to see a route round where they are avoided, and hence I think our concern earlier on about the omission, deliberate or otherwise, of environmental and social aspects we discussed earlier on. So I think we'd really base that on the environmental challenge there and leave the economics to folk who can work out the economics of transferring, well, I was going to say coals to Newcastle, but water to wherever.
But with regards to the economic facts, we would again come back to this issue of leakages. Many of the areas in England where water shortages, and I use parenthesis to use the word shortages, are occurring or feared, still have huge problems with leakage. And efficiency in the system would be efficient for both economic and environmental purposes. We would like to see the emphasis placed on the proper use and efficient use of the water that we abstract, rather than simply saying, oh, well, there's lots of water over there, we'll just get more water here, rather than make more efficient the systems we have for distributing water here already.
Okay, Jim?
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to return, if I may, to the issue that Andy Miles spoke of earlier of sustainability, which he, I think, rightly said goes to the heart of the matter. And I note in the submission from the RSPB Scotland that you state, we believe that any duty on Scottish Water to develop the value of water resources must ensure that any such development is sustainable. And we would recommend, you go on to say, we would recommend inclusion of wording that is consistent with that in section 10(1)(c) to strengthen sustainability. So I'd like to ask what benefit you think there would be in setting out on the face of the bill a requirement for Scottish Water to exercise its non-core functions in a sustainable manner.
I think there'd be a lot of value in doing that, and that ought to be, you know, we need a really strong and clear sustainable development duty at the forefront of the bill.
I think the other thing is if we're to use Scottish Water as a very good example globally of a very responsible way to manage our water resources, to show that we're doing sustainably has to be one of the key elements of that whole, not marketing, but that whole promotion. Scottish Water is, I think, seen as being an ideal governance model for many places. And I think to not have sustainability would be a very odd position to be in.
If I could just say, I think it would also run contrary to the clear indications that we've given to the rest of the world that we want to be world leading in terms of fighting climate change. If we then say, well, our water industry isn't going to have any duty to be using sustainable development for non-core issues, I think we're in danger of looking foolish in the eyes of the world, having said that we intend to lead the world in terms of fighting climate change, because the costs of transporting water, abstracting water and then transporting water around is extraordinary. It uses vast amounts of energy. So you move out from simply the environmental field into the field of full sustainability and our responsibility here in Scotland, freely taken on and unanimously passed in the last Parliament by all of the parties to take a leading role in fighting climate change. I don't want that undermined.
So we have unanimity across the panel of witnesses that that is a significant omission in the bill as it is currently drafted?
Yeah, we don't think it's, it needs to be strong and clear. So yes, I think it is an omission.
Can I just tease out what that means in practice? What practical examples do you have of what the effect of not having that requirement on the face of the bill will actually be? What will that allow to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen?
This is, again, one of these matters that's down to governance, and we consider it fairly fully in our paper Governance Matters, produced earlier in the year. And we look at the effect of clauses in a bill, clearly stating that there is responsibility for sustainable development. We have asked the question, is it worth having them? And the answer, we believe, is yes, because you are passing the law of the land. A bill is not a policy statement. It is not a strategy document. It is law, and it should be justiciable. It should be justiciable, justiciable. It should be something which any citizen can take up as a matter in a court of law if he believes that it's not being dealt with properly. If the law clearly states that there is a duty for sustainability in the bill, then that can be done. I can't predict the outcome of the decision of the court, as it either relates to process or to merit. But it would be a matter that was clearly justiciable, and you would not have to go to court to suggest that, in fact, under international obligations, the Scottish Government had that duty in any case under the Water Framework Directive. It would be better to have it in Scots law on the face of the bill rather than to have to go to court and say, well, it's in the Water Framework Directive, so you've got to do it in any case.
I think with one eye on climate change, that we're just aware that there are many examples globally of over-abstraction from key water supply sources that have led to dramatic economic damage and environmental damage for the region. Places like Lake Chad or I'm trying to think of the Aral Sea, which have to all intents and purposes shrunk to between 50 and 20% of their original size due to economic drivers, you know, to produce water for irrigation, that has had dramatic impacts on the environment and in fact on the wider economy. And I'm not suggesting that that sort of large-scale effect is about to happen in Scotland, but there are many, many examples of that scale, and there must also be smaller ones where there has been a conflict.
What I was trying to tease out was, and I welcome the responses that we've had from the witnesses, was what practical and material impact this may have in a Scottish context. Perhaps RSPB could help us.
Sorry, I'm not that clear on...
Well, you've set out very clearly the principle that sustainability should be placed as a duty on the face of the bill. What I'm asking you is what material and practical impact that would have in a Scottish context. Mr. Spray has given an international example, and what I'd like to know, are there any examples specific to Scotland that you can share with the committee, either now or on reflection?
I mean, as this goes forward, and Scottish Water will be expected to develop the value of Scotland's water resources, our view is that it, you know, instills sufficient safeguard to ensure that that development is sustainable.
I
think it was looking forward.
It is, in a sense, hypothetical, but if I go back to the example I gave earlier with the Edinburgh water supply, the flow of the Tweed, and indeed the flow of the Tay, which after all is one of Britain's largest rivers, is heavily controlled by the reservoirs upstream. So what you take out fundamentally affects what's down below. And as I gave you the example in the Tweed, that's a very important salmon industry, as well as being an iconic fish and flagship of Scotland. £18 million, 512 jobs in that one situation. Now that could be affected by overtaking water from those upper reservoirs, because you won't then have the ability to release water into the stream. And I think it's the assurance that we're looking for. I mean, you're quite right to challenge us about can we have examples, but at the moment the system is working very well, and at the moment we have a lot of water. Scotland, maybe not actually necessarily in the Buchan and the east side, Scotland is blessed with a very good water resource. But with climate change coming in, and with the impacts of climate change operating very dramatically even over small areas, we want to get that assurance built into this.
Thank you very much. Can I just move on to a slightly different point, which is, do you have any concerns about the financing that would be required to fulfil the new duties that are being placed on Scottish Water, and what impact that may have on consumers, the consumer interest?
I will just refer you back to my earlier example, the fantastic example in South West Water of it's somewhere between 60 and 70 pence on the bills, releasing £9 million over 30 years for tremendous work in the catchment, which has proven to be fantastically cost-benefit positive. That will give you an example, but otherwise I don't suppose we're finance experts.
Yes, I would agree that we're probably not the greatest experts on finance, but I am not absolutely certain that there is a huge cost addition to Scottish Water in fulfilling these duties. I think that these duties, as particularly general duties for sustainable development, are consistent with other duties which all public bodies in Scotland have under the Climate Change Act, for example. And therefore, it might be said that there are no additional costs being placed on Scottish Water by this bill. But under other legislation and other laws, they already have duties which have to be accounted for.
Sorry, if I can just add that the Scottish Government did estimate that there could be £10 million of savings over 25 years in one large drinking water catchment if this catchment management approach was adopted. Therefore, you know, there's potential for savings to be made and passed on to customers as well.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
If we move on to part 4 of the bill, raw water quality, Gordon.
Part 4 of the bill provides powers for Scottish Water to gain access to inspect and monitor factors that may affect the quality of raw water, and then enter agreement with landowners to implement best practice. Can you explain why you think placing a further duty on Scottish Water and SEPA and others to work in partnership to deliver sustainable land management is necessary?
I think some of the examples we've given already of the huge success, I think that's what we're pointing to, towards partnership working is what we'd say. Treat the problem at the source, work with the people who are at the source, the local communities, find out what their benefits will be. Look at multiple benefits, not so it could be, as I said, you know, flood benefits, wildlife benefit, access, tourism, all of these added together. And we just think that our experience of the way the partnership has worked in the Flood Act is really good. And I think, again, NGOs, non-governmental organisations have been key in helping deliver that. So we just would like to stress that we think this is one of the most positive areas of the bill. And we'd like to see it developed and to include the NGOs amongst all the others.
And if I can add, it again is an argument relating to consistency. Parliament, again, unanimously passed within the Climate Change Act the Sustainable Land Use Strategy for the whole of Scotland, which is about multiple uses of land. You can't extricate the water regime from land use. And it simply makes sense and consistency to put it in this bill and to make sure that it is a duty. It is possibly a duty that through the Climate Change Act already exists, but to clarify the matter, I don't think would cause any harm.
So I think we might refer there to the ecosystem approach, which is the approach that's actually fundamental to the land use strategy. And the ecosystem approach actually talks about local knowledge, working at the appropriate local scale, working in partnership with other key organisations. So it's, as my colleague has said, it's actually more of the same, and we'd just like to see it really emphasised. This is really good news.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we move on to the sewerage network, Margaret, you've got some questions.
Good morning. In your report, you says that you would like further action to be taken to encourage registration and maintenance of septic tanks. What other further action would you like to see to encourage this registration and maintenance?
I think we suggested that the development planning process could be looked at to see whether there were any stages in that process whereby it encouraged and incentivised people to register septic tanks. So that's something that really needs to be looked at. I mean, the reason we came up with that is there are indications that, you know, septic tanks, we don't have a good handle on where they all are and how well they're all being maintained. So it makes SEPA's job very difficult. And, you know, research has indicated that, you know, phosphate pollution is arising from septic tanks where we don't even know, you know, where the exact locations of them are. So I think we were just hoping that perhaps gaps could be plugged through this bill to maybe look at, as I say, the development planning process.
SEPA actually says for new builds this is actually happening.
It's already in,
tanks,
okay.
Yeah. I think the problem is then existing septic tanks as well, how to get them registered as well and on the...
So in that case, perhaps it could be, you know, awareness raising campaigns and all these types of things to try and encourage people to register.
Okay. And finally, about water shortage. Can you expand on your comments in the written evidence that suggests that Scottish Water should develop a strategy to reduce water consumption and improve water efficiency?
Yeah, so
part of that's an economic case. As a water company, one of your biggest costs is energy, as I said, and it's from pumps. And you pump water up to a treatment work, you pump water from the treatment work to the tap, you pump it from the tap to the sewage treatment works. That's where all your costs is. Now, if you have a leakage rate of somewhere between 30 and 40%, and I'm not quite sure what Scottish Waters is at the moment, but it'll be in that area, that's an awful lot of energy being used and carbon being used to pump unnecessarily. So this is really an economic case, and it's also about looking at the downside, not the supply end, but the demand end, and actually trying to promote conservation and education. I think there's perhaps a missing trick in this is actually education and awareness raising and all of this, and it goes back to your very good point about septic tanks as well. So I think that's what we're looking for there to be put in.
On this question of leakage, I mean, I think it would be safe to say that the environment organisations have much appreciated the improvements that have been made in the last several years under administrations of all colours through this Parliament in reducing leakage. There has been a huge amount of energy and pressure put into reducing wastage, but there is still a long way to go. I don't, again, know the exact percentage figure at the present moment, but it has been coming down. We just want to see it keep coming down, because that will save energy and save costs.
You eventually reach an economic level of leakage where it's obviously not worth chasing it any further, but you can certainly get down into the teens if one looks further south and elsewhere, which is a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean, going back to like sort of water consumption, what other things do you think could be done for the private individuals, households, businesses, etc., to raise, and young people in schools, to raise the awareness of how important water is and not to waste it?
I think this is, again, the importance of perhaps trying to encourage the education end of all of this. And I think you're absolutely right. It is about changing individuals' behaviour, and maybe that's where part of this is missing. I always say it's a bit like if you tell children that if they go out of their house at the moment, they leave the gas on, the electricity on, and the water on, assuming the house doesn't either flood or blow up, their bills will look dramatically higher for two of those. And on the water side, there will be no change. And it comes back to one of the key issues of this whole bill, which is about value. And until we actually individually value water, and it's a word used very much at the beginning, and I think you're right at the individual level, then that will continue. And we won't see that that's an energy cost, it's a pumping cost, it's a waste cost.
A major part of the travel of Scotland and the rest of the planet to sustainability is attitudinal change. And attitudinal change is a major part of the Climate Change Act here in Scotland. It needs to be replicated across the water environment. And government has already been doing good work in this area. Yet again, it's an area where we think that there is room for improvement. And that is the reason for our submission, that we should continue in the direction that Scotland has already been travelling in, because it will take us further down the road towards sustainability, and that there are economic, social and environmental benefits to be obtained from going down that road.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else got any further questions? No? Okay, that's been very helpful. Thank you very much for coming and giving us your evidence today. That ends our business for today, although if members could stay back so that we can discuss the visit today. Our next meeting will be on 26th of September, when we'll continue to take to our consideration of the Water Resources Bill, and we'll also take evidence on the active travel elements of the draft budget 2013-14. But thank you very much.